We can't have a discussion about China without at least touching on Taiwan. It's a long-standing issue, perhaps the single issue that you could point to that's threaded through the entire Sino-American relationship for all these decades. You know, and I think one of you mentioned earlier that it was concern over Taiwan. I think, Randy, you said that in part caused the Chinese to build up their military capability. Do the Chinese really think the United States is going to go to war with China over Taiwan? And why is that issue such an impossible to resolve problem between the two countries, between the U.S. and China?
Well, we have, I think, very different objectives. China is driven by their view that this is an issue of sovereignty, an internal matter, and that really it's an unresolved issue left over from the Civil War that they believe is within their right to resolve. The United States has developed an important relationship with Taiwan, separate and apart from China, and it has included the fostering of a very robust democracy in Taiwan, a modern market economy, and so forth. So for China, a very sensitive sovereignty issue. For the United States, other things creep in like democracy and human rights and a friendly relationship we've developed with Taiwan. And so this has been particularly difficult. Do they believe we might intervene militarily? Well, there's language in our law, the Taiwan Relations Act, that certainly suggests we might because we have to maintain the capacity to resist force. The president would be required to report to the Congress if there were a threat against Taiwan and then convey what the plans would be to respond to that. And also there's history. We did deploy 2 aircraft carriers to the region in 95, 96. If you go back even further, of course, in the 1950s, the Chinese would very much blame the 7th Fleet for preventing reunification after the Civil War concluded in 1949. So yeah, I think it's something they remain concerned about.
David?
Well, I think I would agree with everything that was said. I would just add to the 1995-96 crisis, I think the Chinese were surprised by the magnitude of the American response. I don't think it was ever too much in risk that it would go out of control, but I think they were surprised by the magnitude of President Clinton's response at the time, which goes to show that once you get into a conflict situation, you can't always control each other's response, and I think that's the danger. But I'd like to end this part of the discussion on a more hopeful note, and that is that we have a president in Taiwan at this time, Ma Ying-jeou, who's made efforts, along with China's President Hu Jintao, to kind of try to diffuse the tension in the Taiwan Straits.
I think our other experts as well, we asked them that same question, agree with the idea that Taiwan and other issues like that are not likely to bring the U.S. and China to war. Let's see what they have to say.
I don't think China wants to have any wars. It wants to develop itself economically. Wars would be a distraction. It wants to avoid real security crises. On the other hand, it also, I think, does aspire to be a great power in a very full way.
It's understandable that China would want to secure its supply of natural resources from Africa and other places for that matter. It has become a leading manufacturing center in the world, and natural resources are what drive that. China, in effect, is replacing us as the key manufacturing center. And what matters most for the United States is how China's quest for resources affects governance in Africa and affects environmental protection. Because, at least at the outset, China is pursuing this in a way that promote corruption, promote environmental damage.
I think the most likely conflicts that are going to come for China in the search for resources are not going to be necessarily conflict with the United States or kind of a great power conflict. But I think what is happening already, that China is finding that when it deals with African countries or Latin American countries, that it faces the same type of problems that the European and the U.S. faced in dealing with these countries. Is that many of them are unstable, many of them don't have complete control over their territory, many of them have insurgencies. And so China's efforts to say, well, we separate business from politics, it won't be tenable. They won't be able to continue acting in that way. And you can already see in some states that there's been a pushback.
Another area I want to touch on before we run out of time is one mentioned by one of our other experts, and that is competition for resources. He mentioned energy in Africa, but that's also going on in the Middle East as well, as China expands its interests there. Is that an area where the United States and China will find themselves increasingly in competition for energy resources, perhaps other kinds of resources, not just in Asia, but well beyond Asia? Randy?
Well, I think it's quite clear that China's consumption is going to continue to increase, so will ours, and so that puts us in the same space of needing energy. What's the real problem, as I think some of the commentators noted, is if you could say, the externalities associated with that. China's support for some unsavory regimes, their investment in these countries that does tend to breed and support corruption, the fact that they're sort of taking a neo-mercantile approach to the acquisition of energy when in fact there's very mature markets and these are fungible commodities and so forth. So I think it's a space that we're going to both be occupying, and that also creates the possibility of cooperation, but there are second and third order effects to this that are going to be troublesome and that we're going to have to deal with.
David, do you want to comment on that competition?
Well, I think the governance problems that both Randy and the commentators pointed to are genuine. There's an interesting World Bank report out that says, however, that Chinese investment in Africa, when much of the rest of the world wasn't investing in Africa, had some plus aspects as well as the negative. I think we need to keep that in mind. The other thing is that the Chinese now have what they call their going global policy, where with its almost $2 trillion in foreign exchange, it's beginning to invest in resource extraction. And in that sense, it's increasing the pool of oil and resources in the world through its investment. At the same time, it's representing some competition on the demand side. So I would say this whole area of resources has its pluses and its minuses.
David Lampton, Dean of Faculty and Director of China Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies in Washington at Johns Hopkins University, and Randy Schriver, a founding partner at Armitage International and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Thanks to both of you for being on Great Decisions. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And thank you as well for watching Great Decisions. We'll see you next week. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at greatdecisions.org. Great Decisions is available on DVD. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call 1-800-PLAY-PBS. Funding for Great Decisions in Foreign Policy is provided by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Star Foundation, Shell International, and the European Commission. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware. Next time on Great Decisions in Foreign Policy.
When post-election rioting broke out in Kenya in 2007, those responsible followed a familiar script.
Member states, they should be responsible to prevent and protect their own people.
But this time, the global community was ready to act. Bloodshed on a massive scale was averted. What lessons can be learned from the Kenya exercise in early intervention? And what does it mean for an emerging doctrine at the United Nations on responsibility to protect?
Next time on Great Decisions in Foreign Policy.